Hi, I am Jody Cohn, and I'm super honored to be here with Titus Chiu, who is the #1 best-selling author, award-winning international speaker, functional neurologist who is on a mission to transform the face of healthcare for millions of people around the world struggling with post-concussion syndrome. And I love Titus because functional neurology is fascinating, and you're really able to heal people that no one else can support or help. And so I'd love if you could just talk a little bit about how the parasympathetic nervous system plays into your work.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's such an important topic. And I'm so glad that you're bringing this information out to the world because, on one level, it's just when we talk about the nervous system, we can break it down to a lot of different components, but we have what's known as the autonomic nervous system. And so, two categories is the sympathetic fight or flight, and then the parasympathetic, which is the rest, digest, and heal. And when a person is in a state of sympathetic overdrive, it's virtually impossible to heal from anything, from a concussion, from a head injury, from trauma, or even chronic stress. So when we talk about the parasympathetics, a lot of the work that I've done is I've found ways of using the senses, whether it's sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, or even movements or eye movements, to trigger a parasympathetic response. And yeah, in this talk today, I'd love to share with the audience one simple thing that they can do, or maybe a few more, to actually do that.
Yeah, that would be amazing. And I know that you work with the true brain, and I was hoping you could relate that back to the parasympathetic nervous system.
Yeah, so that's a really great model developed. The triune brain is a great model developed by a neuroscientist called Paul MacLean years ago. And it's just a really wonderful framework to understand, number one, the actual evolutionary process of the nervous system, but number two, how it relates to function. And so I use this a lot in explaining, with my patients or clients, as well as understanding it for myself. So the triune brain, it looks at breaking the brain up into three parts. And so the first part is the newest area over here, right?
I love it.
Yeah, which we call the neocortex or the dolphin brain. I love that name better, right? The dolphin brain, which refers to all these different structures that make up the higher centers of our nervous systems that allow us our personality, allow us our ability to tap into spirituality or create the arts and philosophy and all these wonderful things. So that's what we call the neocortex or the dolphin brain. And so that's one of the newest structures, not only evolutionarily, but also when we develop from an infant growing up into adults, this is one of the later structures that then fully matures. You probably heard that saying, like, women are much more mature than men. There's actually a biological truth because many women's brains, and this is a generalization, but many women's brains, the frontal lobe develops sooner in women than in men. But that's just
When does it develop? Because they say that about teenagers too, like their brain hasn't formed.
Exactly. So that's the thing. For women, it's earlier on. It's probably closer to the late teenage years. But for men, it's sometimes maybe 20 or 25 years old. In some cases, 43, like myself. It's a work in progress, right?
Yeah, right.
So anyways, that's what we call the dolphin brain or the neocortex in this triune brain model. And this is a really important concept we'll explore further in our talk later. But the second part of the triune brain is what we call the mammalian brain. And that refers to what a lot of us know as the limbic system. So this deals more with emotions and bonding with other humans and just kind of connecting with ourselves and our loved ones, right? So, and that's these deeper structures. So you can see here is the outer portion, the neocortex.
Right.
And buried deep within the nervous system is what we have, like the limbic system. We have areas such as the hippocampus, which relates to memory as well as navigation spatially. And then we have the amygdala, as you probably know of, which is very...
Can you point to the amygdala so people can see that?
Yeah, the amygdala is actually buried really deep. You can't really see it in this.
Yeah, it's hard to explain.
Yeah,
Thank you.
exactly, because it's like buried super deep and it's like this little nugget. It's almost like an almond shape, which the name comes from. And so it's buried super deep in these structures. So I actually had to
disassemble, sorry.
No, that's not a problem. because we'll get to this structure as well. So yeah, it's the amygdala is buried super deep in this structure as part of this whole circuit of Papez we talk about that's related to the limbic system. So yeah, that's the second part of the triune brain, which is what we call the mammalian brain, or the paleo mammalian brain, which again refers to not only the function, like in terms of emotions and bonding, but the evolutionary, development throughout, not only globally, like, from a global macroscopic model of just evolution, but also within our own development again. So it's kind of like the neocortex developed like later on for some of us, in our 40s, and the mammalian brain or limbic system developed earlier on. And then finally, the third part of the triune brain is the reptilian brain. And that refers to the brainstem as well as the cerebellum. So the brainstem here, we have composed of three parts: the top, middle, and bottom. The top is what we call the midbrain. The middle is the pons, and finally the bottom is the medulla. Now I'm explaining all this because it's going to make a lot of sense in terms of what you can do to take control of your senses as well as your autonomic nervous system. So it's really important to understand these concepts. That's why I'm
No, I love it. And I love that you have visual aids. Thank you.
Sure. And then, so yeah, the reptilian brain, brainstem, as well as the cerebellum, which deals with motor coordination. But interestingly enough, a lot of more recent research has found that the cerebellum deals with things like autonomic regulation, like the balance of sympathetic and parasympathetic. The cerebellum also contributes to cognition and smoothness of thought, which is really cool because it plays a big part in my work. That's why this structure is so important in a lot of what I do in terms of using the senses to retrain the brain, because the cerebellum classically, like I said, deals with movement and coordination and balance, but it's also tied with autonomic control, like sympathetic tone and balance, as well as parasympathetic, but also emotional regulation and even immune function, and as well as cognition. So by using specific movement exercises like balance exercises, movements of the arm, eye exercises, we can not only retrain the cerebellum for all those functions like motor functions, it has spillover into the emotional world, the cognitive world, as well as sympathetic, parasympathetic balance. Yeah, it's really cool. So anyway,
and for those of people who don't know what functional neurology is, you kind of touched on it, but can you explain that a little bit, and how you use movement to help the body and the brain function?
Yeah, great question. So functional neurology is really, it's very similar to conventional neurology, but the biggest contrasting points are, number one, the therapies that we bring to the table. So in conventional neurology, unfortunately, a lot of the options, they're limited. It's like you have medications or you have surgery for the most part. And in terms of, so for functional neurology, it's like the sky's the limit. If you understand the process of neuroplasticity, meaning how you can use your experiences to rewire your brain, it's really the sky's the limit. So we'll be talking about that. But for example, like the midbrain at the top of the brainstem, which is a really important control center for the autonomic nervous system, it processes lights and sounds. So based on that understanding, if someone's midbrain is overactive, which leads to a heightened sympathetic fight or flight response, what we can do, very simple, we can dampen lights and we can dampen sound. So wearing sunglasses or plugging the ears can really help people who have overactive midbrains, which can look in the real world might be anxiety or a startle response, or maybe they're really sensitive to lights and sounds, as happens after a concussion. So understanding all the specific functions of the nervous system in the functional neurology model, we can then use sensory-based therapies to rewire the brain. So, but in conventional neurology, it's kind of like, oh, you have pain, take a pain medication. So it's more about suppressing symptoms, where functional neurology is all about finding balance and rewiring the brain through, for example, the senses. But we can also bring in higher brain functions. Again, this goes back to the triune brain model. We can also, with functional neurology, we can rewire the frontal lobe by doing things like meditation or even Sudoku or like crossword puzzles. You know, we can rewire like the parietal lobe through body awareness exercises, or there's a meditation that we call like a body scan that rewires the right frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. We can rewire the temporal lobe through music. And like in a lot of our conversations, you can use the sense of smell and aromatherapy and essential oils to activate like the frontal lobe as well as the limbic structures. So that's functional neurology in a nutshell. It's like,
so basically you really understand what makes certain areas of the brain over and underactive, and based on that you can then use the senses to either stimulate or sedate certain areas so that it returns it to balance.
that is brilliant. Yeah, you very succinct, exactly. Is
Yeah.
it underactive? Is it overactive? And then from there, understanding what the actual area of the brain processes, we can target it with the utmost specificity. It's like
Right.
so specific. So for example, if we find someone has anxiety, a lot of times from a neurological perspective, it's several reasons. It could be that the right frontal lobe is overactive. So to engage, one way of balancing that out is to engage the left frontal lobe. And one way you can do that is take lavender essential oil and breathe in through your
I'll
left
demonstrate.
nostril.
Yes. I love that. I do that. I used to get anxiety attacks, honestly, in supermarket checkout lines when it would take too long. And obviously now it's taking forever. So I don't leave home without this because
Yeah,
it just
right.
helps me calm down.
Yeah, it's just like this immediate response. Like it works from this more kind of neuroplasticity model, because when you smell things into your left nostril, it really goes more directly to your left frontal lobe and what we call the olfactory cortex, which
Right, because the olfactory channel goes directly up.
and the second thing, it also works neurochemically because lavender has like GABA, which is the calming neurotransmitter, has
Right,
those
inhibiting.
properties as well. You know, so yeah, that's like in a nutshell, that's functional neurology. It's like understanding. So for example, I've had patients or clients come to me like, I don't know what's going on. I just feel stressed and ramped up all the time. I can't sleep. I have chronic pain or headaches, you know, or I feel anxious, but everything in my world is pretty good. What's going on? And a lot of the answer to that is because their nervous systems have become out of balance. And so once I find out where in the nervous system, is it in, you know, the neocortex? Is it in these areas over here, the mammalian brain, right? The paleomammalian cortex or the limbic system, or is it in the brainstem or cerebellum? When I find out what those areas are, I can then specifically target it to not only the region, but like in our conversation right here, the sidedness, right? Smelling into the left nostril goes here. Or if you do a balance exercise on your left foot, it activates your left cerebellum versus the right. And so we can become very specific. And through the miracle of neuroplasticity, we can, number one, bring balance to the nervous system. And we can also strengthen areas that are weaker, or we can calm down areas that are overactive.
And getting back to the brainstem, what parts of the brainstem correlate to what parts of the nervous system, and how can that get thrown out of balance?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So in our context of the triune brain, so the brainstem is the reptilian brain, right? And so the brainstem, it's really interesting because the top part of the brainstem, the midbrain, it's kind of like a really, actually all these areas are really important points in like the autonomic nervous system, like sympathetic, parasympathetic balance. But the top part of the brainstem, when we activate it, it triggers a powerful sympathetic response. And this is actually part of a larger neural network that we call the reticular activating system. So when this becomes activated, it's all about like being alert. It's all about survival.
Right, sensing danger.
Yeah, the interesting thing is when I was like kind of reflecting on our conversation before we had it, I was just like, you know what? All areas of the triune brain are about survival, but it's just how we go about doing it, right? Like when we develop compassion for others, you know, and we develop foresight by training our frontal lobes, that helps us survive and thrive, right? And when we develop bonding through limbic structures, that's all about survival too. you know, but then, and then the brainstem, it's all about survival as well. But if you think about it, it's kind of like different levels of evolution of even like humanity, right? It's like this stuff is really survival, but on a very just kind of like visceral level. So if the midbrain becomes activated, you're just going to be in high alert all the time. And that's kind of goes back to a lot of the patients and clients I work with. It's because even if things in their world are okay, for whatever reason, they don't know why, they just feel on edge. And it's because of this structure has overcome all these other structures. And that's what happens, you know, like for example, the midbrain, when it, and this happens a lot in trauma, after someone experiences trauma or concussion or even emotional traumas, this area goes into red alert. And if the trauma is strong enough or chronic enough, even if it's like a micro trauma, this midbrain gets stuck in overdrive. So all of a sudden, like what should help us kind of like survey our environment just when threats arise, it's always on high alert. And so it could be like a mental trigger that triggers like an exaggerated stress response.
Right. Like even if thinking about losing your job, even if you've
Yeah,
had great reviews,
just
all of a
project
sudden.
right into the future. Yeah, because the midbrain is also tied in this structure we call the basal ganglia, which is deep into the brain. Basal ganglia kind of puts the stop on like unwanted thoughts, right? So
Oh,
yeah, so
like the frontal cortex, it's kind of the overdrive.
the frontal cortex plays a role in the basal ganglia, but so does the midbrain. And
Oh,
this was a point I wanted to bring up later, but it's a perfect time. So like when we think about the triune brain, right? And we think about it in terms of the evolution of these structures, like these structures are found like in reptiles, right? That's why we call it the reptilian brain, but they're also found in us. But in addition to that, it's like as we developed as human beings from infant to adult, right? These areas are just raging when we're a baby. That's why our pulse and our heart rate as a baby, or our pulse, are just like, you know, it's like 100 beats per minute, whereas most adults it's like 50 or 60, is because when we're infants, these areas are just going unfiltered, right? And so that's why infants have that moral reflex, the startle response, because there's no filter on the midbrain. But as we develop and we mature, the frontal lobe as well as the limbic structures start to put the brakes on the overactive midbrain. But check this out, right, Jody? When we experience trauma or concussion, or you know, any type of trauma, right?
right.
This area lights up and it goes into overdrive. It's kind of like the accelerator pedal, right? And in many cases, because of trauma, you know, when you have release of adrenaline or cortisol, or if you actually, in the case of concussion, you actually have a damage to the brain, like I did many, many years ago in my car accident, when you have like damage, what ends up happening is you lose the gate, right? That suppression, that kind of calming aspect of the frontal lobe on your brainstem. So it becomes, so guess, no matter what you do, if you try to meditate, you try to talk yourself, you know, positive thoughts and positive thinking, you try to say, okay, everything's going to be okay. Everything's okay. Your frontal lobe doesn't have the capacity to really believe that or to do that. So when it comes to that, which do you think is going to win? Do you think
Interesting.
yeah,
That's
do you
so well
think it's going
put.
to be the, you know, the neocortex, the frontal lobe, when it comes to kind of like the survival conversation in our brains, or is it going to be the midbrain and the brainstem?
This is amazing, and this is a great segue. So how do you help people like yourself that had the car accident and their ability to enter the parasympathetic state is kind of not accessible?
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I wanted to really kind of frame this conversation so you understand and our audience understands this whole triune brain model. So if we try to engage the frontal lobe and it's compromised from a trauma or from excessive chronic stress from years, right, leading to mild neurodegeneration, it's not going to be able to do all its wonderful functions of being present and being patient and, you know, being like, you know, just like grounded.
That must be why so many people who try to meditate either can't do it or
Yeah,
feel like it's worthless.
yeah, exactly. That's the thing. Like I have so many patients, and even myself, when I was like in the dark stages of my recovery after my concussion, when I would try to bring like, you know, and that's the danger of it sometimes, this whole positivity movement. It's like, oh, just be positive. Oh, it's not a big deal. It's like, actually it is.
They're skipping some steps. They
Yeah,
don't know that's not
exactly.
the first step. So what would be the first step? How do you help people?
Yeah, that's a great question. Whenever I work with clients and patients, the first step is number one, getting to the root cause. Where in the nervous system is the breakdown? But from there, the second step is we have to rebuild from the foundation. And guess what the foundation is? When we go back to the triune brain model, it's the quote unquote reptilian brain. It's the things like the brainstem, it's the things like the cerebellum, and that's where the senses come in. So I almost never start with, oh, just go sit on a yoga mat for an hour and meditate, unless, my patient or clients have already had a lot of training and developed
Yeah,
a lot of frontal lobe like bandwidth, so to speak. I
correct.
might use that as an access point into healing. But many patients, especially if they've had a concussion, even if they have practiced meditation for years, this area becomes compromised because it literally sits right behind our forehead here, the prefrontal lobe especially. And that's the area that really deals with our higher selves. So it's very susceptible to injury after a concussion. But in addition, even with chronic stress, like things like excessive cortisol or excessive adrenaline can really just shut off the frontal lobe. So yeah, going back to your question, where do we start from the foundation? So doing things like movement training, like exercise, like I spoke about before, but very specific exercises. So for example, if you've had a concussion or brain injury, or if you've been under chronic stress and you find that you have this sense that you just don't feel grounded anymore. And it's this very kind of like, it's actually a physical experience, but then people, they try to kind of interpret it as their experience of it is they just feel unsteady, right?
Yes.
I don't feel balanced, like. But a lot of people think that's an actual, like a metaphor. But when I do a neurological
For me,
exam,
it feels like overwhelm. Like I can't even focus on one thing because I'm so
yeah,
ADD.
that speaks more to the midbrain. But what I'm speaking to some clients and patients of mine who just literally feel like, yeah, I just feel off balance. They might not have equated to that they think it's like a metaphorical thing, right? It's just kind of like, oh, it's an analogy to how I'm feeling. But when I do an exam, many times their balance is actually off, right? And so it's like their minds are trying to interpret this subconscious physical thing that's actually happening. And so for them, it's like a cerebellar thing. So we give them balance training. We give them yoga exercises. We give, and I can, if it's 1 foot versus, the left cerebellum or right cerebellum, we'll give them a balance exercise on the left foot or the right foot. So for those of you out there who don't have access to a functional neurologist, you can test yourself. Just do a simple balance test, balance on your left foot and then balance on your right foot. See if one of them is more unsteady. More likely than not, it's because one of your cerebellums, the side that's more unsteady, isn't as strong as the other one. And what can you do? Simple. You do a balance exercise on that foot that is more unsteady. And when that improves, now guess what? Not only does your balance and your muscles get stronger, we're actually changing the strength of your cerebellum, right? And so we could take that concept, and for what you had described, for you, it's more kind of like this ADD or ADHD where it's hard for you to just kind of focus. That sounds more like to me either number one, a reticular activating system overdrive, like what we're talking about, the midbrain. And we'll talk about ways we can, calm that. Or number two, yeah, it can be because the frontal lobe, which helps us to focus and sit and be present, maybe that's been, a little sleepy. But the great news
Right.
is, Jody, regardless of what's, where you're at right now, there's so many things, and same thing for everyone watching out there. Through the miracle of neuroplasticity, there's so many things that we can do to rebuild these areas and bring back function that might have been lost. Or even what I love doing now, ever since I've gone through my healing journey, is taking my brain, which is pretty healthy brain right now, but taking it to the next level, because it's the same principles. But yeah, going back to what we were talking about with you,
Yeah.
I see that with a lot of my patients and clients as well after trauma, whether it's concussion or whatnot. The midbrain becomes overactive, right? And if they have compromise to the frontal lobe from like a concussion, as an example, no matter what they try to do, if they try to, the analogy is like, think about like a child, right? A little kid that, they're kind of overactive, right? And their teacher's like, just sit down and focus. Is that going to work? No, they don't have the frontal lobe bandwidth. But guess what does work, Jody? And I'm sure you're aware of this research. Recess. You have
Yeah.
the kids go out and play and crawl around and tumble and do somersaults and bump their, knees and smell things and eat things, and, breathe fresh air. Like all those, the reason why that works, after they have recess, they find that when they go back to the classroom, they could sit and focus and their bad behavior goes away.
Well,
Is because,
yeah. No, you said something else early on when you were talking about the tri-brain and how kind of gratitude and connection also get you out of the brainstem. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, yeah. So the interesting thing is, remember how I said like all these structures deal with survival, but it's just a different way, like a different expression of that. So when we talk about things like gratitude and we talk about, loving kindness meditation as an example, those are powerful ways of activating the vagus nerve, right? And so we'll get into that in a little bit, but the way we do that is through these other structures. We actually bring support. We engage, for example, when we practice gratitude, it engages the frontal lobe. And when we practice loving kindness, it engages the limbic system. So there's what we call, like all these things I'm telling you, they're like brain regions, right? Frontal lobe, limbic system, brainstem. But the beautiful thing is they all should be communicating on what we call neural networks. And it's the activation patterns of these neural networks. So for example, if you activate, if you think about like a friend of yours, right? If you just bring their like thought consciousness into awareness or the thought of them, it engages your frontal lobe as well as maybe your hippocampus, which deals with memories. But then when you then bring this loving kindness meditation, at the same time, it engages the limbic system. So that's this neural network of loving kindness and compassion. And then the more you do that, these areas get stronger and stronger. But my point is, when you engage that, then it also, not only does it, you're sending this good energy out into the universe and to the person you're thinking about, it also helps put the brakes on your midbrain.
I love that.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one route of calming your sympathetics and activating your parasympathetics. Is actually what I call a top-down approach, where we're using the neocortex, right, as part of the triune brain model. We're using the higher centers to help balance out sympathetic, parasympathetic balance. But again, Jody, the question is, well, for some people who've been under chronic stress, for some people who've experienced trauma, that might be really difficult for them to do, even just to maintain focus of some idea. So what do we do in those situations? Well, check this out. Again, it goes back to the whole reptilian brain. So if this guy is stuck in overdrive and we're trying to engage the frontal lobe, which takes a lot of energy, right? If you're stressed out and you're just trying to be present and focused or whatever, and, have compassion, it's really hard, right? Because it takes a lot of energy. Because who's going to win if this guy and this guy go to battle in terms of survival? Almost always it'll be the reptilian brain, unless you train and train and train this, right? And you've developed neuroplasticity over years. Like, you look at those Tibetan monks or those monks who
Right.
meditation all day, every day for like decades. But that's the thing. We all have the ability to get there. It's just through, consistent practice.
Right.
But
And
anyways,
you mentioned movement. What else do you do to activate the brainstem?
Yeah, so that's the thing. Um, if this is stuck in overdrive, we can take advantage of this same triune brain idea and use the bottom of the brainstem to put the brakes on the midbrain, on this top part. And so
Say
because,
more.
what's that?
Oh, say more. Elaborate on that.
Yeah, exactly. So the brainstem is, like I said, is part of this reptilian brain. It's this ancient survival structure. The top part is part of what we call the reticular activating system that helps us just stay, alive to survive. And so, but at the same time, the bottom part of the brain, which we call the medulla, it houses a bunch of brain cells and neurons that control respiration, that control like our heartbeat, that control digestive function. And guess who also lives here? There are the cell bodies for what we call the vagus nerve, right? And so the vagus nerve, is this powerful communication line from areas of your body to the medulla. So it's not even the vagus nerve that's the most important player in this. The vagus nerve is just the connector to the medulla. And
So deep breathing or things that innervate and activate the vagus nerve can calm the brainstem?
exactly. So
Oh,
that's the
cool.
thing. So in answer to your question, like, so what can we do about it? If someone's experienced trauma and it's really hard for them to meditate or even practice compassion for themselves or others, we can use then a bottom up approach, meaning we take advantage and we activate the lower brainstem to put the brakes on the top part of the brainstem, which causes that sympathetic response. And so things such as breathing exercises, things such as belly massage, things such as even like what you said, like the loving kindness meditation, but that again, that needs to engage the higher centers, right? So there's a lot of different things that we can do to activate the vagus nerve. Meditation activates the vagus nerve, which activates this lower brainstem. Humming or, toning, like making certain sounds like ah or e, or even like the sacred sound of om, like
Yeah.
all those things actually through our guttural, like it triggers like these sensory pathways, the vibration activates the vagus nerve, which then sends a signal to the brainstem, the lower part of the brainstem, putting the brakes on this guy. And then you start to get this balance of sympathetic overdrive back into balance, more parasympathetic state, and then healing. And so
That's
that's
amazing.
that's the approach I like to take with almost all my patients and clients, because if they've experienced trauma or they've experienced concussion, a lot of times they just don't have the bandwidth here. And they're told, oh, just, think positively, just practice meditation, just do gratitude. Those things will help. But if this guy is in overdrive, it's going to be this uphill battle. So what I like to do first is do things that are easier for them to employ, that don't require a lot of cognitive like energy, and
Right.
utilize the senses. So things like essential oils can also activate the vagus nerve, right? And humming, like I said, even like if you're in your bathroom and you don't have too much sensitivity to pain, like on your face, or a lot of people have concussion have sensitivity to this area. In the bathroom, when you're brushing your teeth in the morning, like just splashing cold water on your face can trigger a parasympathetic response. What it does, it first triggers a sympathetic, but then to balance it out, the parasympathetics then kick into gear. It's all
Oh,
about
that's
balance.
amazing. Yes. Yes. And you've mentioned, I know that the people that are listening are going to want to know, like, how long do I balance on each leg? You've got a great book and some more information. How can people find out more about what you've been talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have a book that I wrote that goes deep into this, like a lot of ideas, and I actually launched an online course as well. So I have an
Oh,
online
can
course.
you share the title?
Yeah, it's called the Brain Save Solution Masterclass.
And
And
where do they find that?
they can go to my website, brainsave.com, and they can find a link to that class there and more information.
This was amazing. Thank you so much for tying everything together so brilliantly.
Yeah, you're welcome.